Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm joined today by Thomas, Ian, Francie, and Phil remotely to discuss the question of, is the culture discussion relevant for the energy transformation? But before we get started, I'd love to tell you a little bit more about who I'm joined by today. So Thomas Birr, over there, is the Chief Strategy and Innovation Officer at E.ON. And Thomas will be giving us the perspective of driving change and transformations in large corporations, which often requires managing stakeholders and other shareholder interests. Ian, you've recently done a really interesting CEO piece of research around culture, and so Ian is a partner at Heidrick Consulting, and I'm really looking forward to hearing more about some of the insights from that report. Francie, so Franziska Eickhoff, is Head of Data Analytics at E.ON Energie Deutschland. And she will provide us with the management and employee perspective, as well as much more based on what we've been talking about behind the scenes. And then last but not least, joining us remotely is Phil Cornell. He's a principal at the Economist group. And I'll summarize it by saying, I think, Phil, you're going to provide us with a perspective from the Economist, but your own opinions as well. So without further ado, when we were preparing for this session, I actually did a little bit of thinking, and I reflected on the question, is the culture discussion relevant for the energy transformation? And actually, I think it's not. I think it's absolutely foundational, not just relevant, but foundational, especially if we want to drive a sustainable transformation in the energy sector. So I'm going to start with Thomas and Francie. And what do you think about my comment, Thomas, that it's not just a question of relevance, but that it's actually foundational to drive this transformation?
Yeah, I agree to a large extent. We as a big utility company, we are in the midst of the energy transformation. And not only in the midst of it, we are driving it. Yeah, our mission is to make energy transformation happen. And that requires a lot of capabilities which are not really in our DNA as where we grew now for the past 120 years. Yeah. It entails reaching out to partnerships. It needs employment of emerging technologies, and it needs a sense of we want to, let's say, grab the chance of changing the world. Yeah. The big challenge for us is there are also a lot of good capabilities and cultural elements which brought us to where we are today. Yeah. I mean, the combination of resilience and performance, which makes us really strong in running our infrastructure and serving our customers, is also something which is needed in future. So how to put the filter of what do we need for the future and what is, let's say, holding us back as a burden, as elements of culture, which stands in our way for transformation. That is one of our big challenges.
So speaking of the future, so Francie, you're someone who really focuses on the future and is inspired by that. What is your perspective on my statement?
Yeah, I absolutely agree, and it's part of our leadership to drive that change, also drive that change for our employees, for our teams. So I think the COVID pandemic brought us more into digital way of working as well. That also helps to, let's say, push a bit more the digital transformation internally. And for sure, we work with our customers more digital, so we involve them more, and then it's possible to, let's say, drive the change together with way of working, with more involvement of the other colleagues perhaps, and also with our customers in terms of, let's say, testing culture, also more failing culture, and so on. So my perspective is, so change is a good thing, and we need that change in terms of cultural change a lot to drive more digital parts.
Thank you. So, Phil, I'm going to come to you after I speak with and get Ian's perspective on this. So the two of you, I'd love to hear your outside-in perspective. So from outside of the energy sector, Ian, and maybe reflect a little bit for us on the CEO study, because there were some really fascinating findings in it.
Yes, we set out to better understand the financial impact of a focus on culture in major transformations. So we interviewed 500 CEOs around the world, and the criteria was they had to lead organizations that were greater than 2.5 billion. About 80% of them were more than 10,000 people, and about 40% of them had more than $10 billion in revenue. And out of those 500, there were 11% that we classified as being culture accelerators, and they were just doing something different. Excuse me. And so these 11% of people had a more than 2 times financial performance over a 3-year period than the rest. So when we ran the numbers around this, there were 3 things that correlated across all factors. One was that those CEOs had to have a very strong personal belief about the impact of culture on financial performance, in that they said it was either very important or crucial. So that was one thing. The second was that they had to put culture front and center of the implementation of their strategy. So it wasn't something that they said, we'll do it next year because we're too busy. Right from the outset, they put culture right at the heart of it. And the third thing they did was put in place a very robust process to deliver that deep into the organization. And so it was really a case of having financial performance and creating a meaningful and collaborative place to work. So interestingly, one of the little side events around this, well, it wasn't side at all, a major impact was that these culture accelerators demonstrated that over 50% of them had a very strong focus on DE&I. Of the rest of them, it was less than 30. So there was something around the people focus as well as a financial focus that really made a difference.
So, and what you're saying is especially the focus on diverse people as
Yes.
well. That's what you mentioned. I was also intrigued when we prepared, and I'm going to come to you in a second, Phil. I was also intrigued when we prepared. You'd made a statement which was in your report also, culture didn't just happen. What was the comment? Do you remember the sentence? I wrote it down.
You either get the culture that you want or you get the one you deserve.
Exactly.
You can do it by intent.
That's it. Great. Thank you. So, Phil, what time is it where you're at? It's early morning?
Oh, Annemie, yes, it's 8 in the morning.
Okay, so we don't know. Then you're awake and you can give us a good answer.
Absolutely. Well, I'm very interested to hear sort of the responses of the panel, you know, and we've been talking a lot here about corporate culture and company culture, but I thought I would just, you know, expand a little bit the frame of what we're looking at. You know, culture is among companies who are building the energy transition, like E.ON, but it's also critical among sort of those who pay for the energy transition. I'm thinking about sort of financiers and institutional investors and large asset managers, and also those who buy. And I'm thinking about consumers. And this issue of diversity, I think, is also really important. I mean, let's start with investors. You know, in the past, the world, you know, we would focus on policy uncertainty or data gaps to explain the slow progress to shift capital into a low carbon economy, including into the energy transition. But despite sort of similar information gaps, we can see that leading climate investors can really outpace their peers. There was a great study in 2017 that found that, you know, cognitive and behavioral biases within this industry of financing can show like large cultural barriers, and particularly around things like, you know, short-termism, where climate is seen as a systemic risk, but it's not a day-to-day issue. Aversion to risk and herd mentalities among investment executives, you know, who are concerned about their don't want to take risks. They're concerned about their career and about reputational risks, and don't see their peers acting in the same way. So there's this kind of herd mentality that comes from that sort of lack of diversity. And what we saw in the financial sector is that, you know, a few key narrative shifts by industry trendsetters can make a big difference. And anecdotally, we hear a lot about, you know, the letter from Larry Fink at the beginning of 2020 that sort of changed the notion within those kind of peer groups and can sort of legitimize climate investment to some degree. And the second group, very quickly, I think is really about consumers and this sort of move towards, across age groups, by the way, not just, let's say, younger millennials. We see quite a similar move across age groups towards more sustainable investment and the willingness to sacrifice for things like the energy transition. So I think that, whether we're talking about finance or we're talking about on the consuming side, this cultural shift makes a big difference. And I'll just end with one point, which is we have to also be thinking about, in the context of diversity, how the energy transition is actually, how culturally diverse consumers are experiencing that energy transition. So from norms around energy consumption and use, for example, things like shared riding, to cultural biases in AI that increasingly manage our energy system. I mean, culture has a profound impact on how the energy transition takes hold and how just that energy transition is. And that's fundamentally a cultural question.
Yeah, and I think what you're introducing there, and I think all of you introduced it actually, is that when we think about culture, we really need to think broadly. We need to think within the organization, but then also about the multiple stakeholders that actually can help drive the energy transition and transformation culturally and otherwise. But that last point of yours was really interesting. And Franzi, I'm going to come to you as it pertains to consumers. And actually one way of changing the culture could be by exposing employees, bringing them closer to the customer, working differently with customers. Do you have experience in that regard?
Yeah, so my team is also responsible for the part of testing and personalization on our website, and also our innovation teams work a lot with the customer to develop new products, and that is something we shouldn't be afraid, like old times, to contact our customers. So they want to talk to us, they want to develop the products, the services, and all this stuff together with us. So, and it's really easy to have a website that is A/B tested all the time, like all the other big companies do so as well. So we love that because we get direct feedback on our services, on our products, on the description of it, and so on. So this is something we really love, and this is something we have to learn, because sometimes that hurts, perhaps, because customers perhaps don't like that product, or they don't understand the service we would like to understand them. So this is something that is also a change, and sometimes a painful change, but we love to see how fast we get through that way of working.
Thank you. Ian, was there anything in your CEO report or elsewhere where you've seen this interplay between driving internal cultural change and exposing, making the customer front and center of that change, or, potentially, as Phil said, investors or other stakeholders?
I mean, there are a number of examples, if you take financial services, for instance, where many banks have now recognized that the future lies really being a commoditized data business. And so many have realized that the only true differentiator they have is their culture and the way that their consumers feel treated. And that goes all the way down to call centers, so that when a consumer rings in, what they're getting is very much the right kind of attention and respect along the way.
So, again, you're making me reflect a little bit, which is, Thomas, you were going to talk about what leadership one requires in a big organization when you're driving this type of cultural transformation. What have been some of your experiences in terms of the leadership that is required?
Yeah, I mean, just before, let's say, credible cultural change materialize in, let's say, visible signals to the outside world, be it to customers, be it to the financial community, it has to start in the company. And it has to start from the top, or it doesn't start at all. Because a cultural change journey is always a from-to journey. And of course, it's a little bit like peace on earth. Everyone wants it, but there are tons of opinions how to get there, right? So the very first thing is to get the top management on one page. Yeah? And just to talk a little bit from where we are at E.ON, as I said, we are offensively and proactively tackling the challenges which are coming from the market as a front runner in that business. We are just about setting up our new strategy at E.ON. And we consciously decided not to rush into the cultural change program before that is done. Yeah? We said, let's get the strategy clear, and then let's say sit down and come on a, let's say, on a joint piece of paper. Where do we want to go? What is our from to story? We have some observations already where cultural change may be necessary when we are talking about breaking up silos, when we are talking about working a little bit less hierarchically, talking about diversity, for example. This all matters, but we are not yet at a point that we are 100% clear what the direction of travel will be. On the other hand, we know that we don't have so many tries to kick it off. Yeah? This shot must really hit. Yeah? So we take our time, and then we are quite confident that we will set up an impactful journey also for the company.
So that really builds on what your research said, right? That 11% that really get it right are planful, thoughtful, don't just expect it to happen.
It does, and there are 4 really key principles to have, because to your point, Thomas, you have to honor the legacy. You know, the thing that got you this far is really important, but there are 4 key things that if you follow those in a very robust way will really help that process. One is purposeful leadership.
Sorry, I couldn't hear that one.
Purposeful leadership. You have to have leaders who mean it, are committed to it, but also this sense of purpose drives you to a long-term outcome whilst navigating short-term problems. The second is personal change. We've all seen leaders who said one thing and done something that contradicts that within days, and that undermines the credibility of the process. The third is broad engagement. You have to get that message through really, really fast and with the momentum. And the fourth is around systemic alignment, is that all the elements within an organization around HR policies, and communications all have to be aligned to support that. But to your point, you know, the most successful transformations start with the senior leaders, and that's where the energy comes from.
Thank you. And Phillip, do you have a perspective on the leadership question in terms of what you're seeing in the context that you were talking about, right? Because I'm assuming leadership would look very different.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, at the Economist Intelligence Unit, we recently completed a really interesting study in partnership with Microsoft on the role of technology to enhance equitable energy planning. And one of the issues that we found there is that leadership in organizations, whether we're talking about city planning, energy planning in a public policy perspective, or in terms of delivering energy services, to the customer at the distribution level, makes a big difference. Partly because, how diversity is included also within the nature of that leadership. So who's also making those decisions can have a big impact on sort of unconsidered biases when engaging with communities that might not be reflected in the decision-making hierarchy of a particular organization. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that we found was that implementing technologies that provide more transparency and, in fact, that democratize some of that decision-making down to the consumer, or at least to the local community level, can have a big impact on mitigating some of the blind spots that might happen within leadership. And again, that's really a question of having not only sort of the data available to you, but also surrounding yourselves as a leader with different points of view that are reflective of your customer base.
Great, thank you. And building on that, Franzi, were you not saying that there was also a different, I'm building on the technology point, right? You gave an example when we were talking earlier about a different way of engaging with customers and how surprised they were.
Yeah, right. So we asked our customers if they would like to talk to us via WhatsApp. So just have a question on service or whatever. And they said, okay, yes, but I'm a bit surprised that E.ON wants to talk to me via WhatsApp. So the channel was accepted because it's known and it's easy, but they haven't seen us there. So this is something we have to build on, because we now will check whether they would like to use that channel. So it will be part of our channel orchestration as well. And then let's see, but I felt, okay, they are not saying, okay, no, this is a private channel or whatever, don't want to talk to you, but they were really surprised that we would love to kick off with them. So yeah, let's see. So we'll try.
Let's see, and I think that builds on your point around how we can actually use some of these different digital technologies to drive some of the culture change that we need to drive. I think we have some questions from the audience, and I'm going to take them because they dovetail very nicely with what we're discussing. And yeah, I love this one. Personally, I don't like being asked the question, but I love the question, so I'm going to ask you anyway. So are there any role models of companies in the market that you all think E.ON or a utility can learn from? And I'm maybe going to ask Ian. Sorry for putting you on the spot.
I mean, yes, there are.
Yeah.
There are. It was interesting to note that Fortune magazine recently ran a survey looking at leadership investment and financial performance, and well over half of their top 25 were companies who has invested very strongly in culture.
That's interesting.
So, you know, they are, you know, it would be wrong for me to name some clients and not others, so I'm going to just sort of skip over that one. But they are generally large, successful companies that wish to stay that way. You know, very often the most successful transitions are, you know, to Thomas's point, who have leaders that look into the future and see where the transition needs lie and decide to act on it early, rather than wait until it's a little bit too late. I'm much more of a fan of the idea of a burning ambition rather than a burning platform. I think it's a much more engaging and much more inspiring attitude to have. So, you know, the ones that have done it really well tend to have done it in time rather than when it's nearly too late.
And Franzi, did you want to comment?
I have 3 of them, but in different aspects. So it's for sure Amazon in terms of A/B testing and personalization. We all know that. So also it's Spotify in terms of agile way of working.
Yeah.
But for me, it's also in terms of culture and treating their employees, it's Google. Because when you were at Google, went there for lunch, talk to the people, have a look at their way of working and their freedom, that is something, I really find really good. And that's there for years already. So it's not just one thing and then let's try again. Google really worked on that for years and you can feel it in the company, I think.
Thomas.
May I just quickly comment on that? So I share Franzi's view that I'm also admiring these companies for the one or the other aspect.
Yeah.
On the other hand, corporate culture is not a Chinese menu where you can pick and choose. At the end of the day, we have also an internal message which should resonate with our employees. The employees, they should, let's say, identify themselves with any kind of role model, and that why it's very difficult to find someone out there, because we are people who have a mission, who have a story to tell, and who are passionate about, let's say, the energy transformation, for example. And where do you find companies who build on, let's say, century-long legacy in moving things, right? I mean, that makes really the search and the quest for a role model so difficult, right?
It does, and I think you're making a very important point, that often when we talk about culture change, we almost forget to honor and acknowledge that often that is built on the past, and that culture change is an ongoing journey and evolution. You don't start it today. I mean, you have to be very planful, and you don't start it today and it's finished tomorrow, tick the box, okay, let's now move on to something else, right? It's part of how a company grows, evolves, etc. Having said that, in the context of constantly evolving a culture, sometimes we get things right, sometimes we fail. So failure is also an opportunity for learning. And maybe if I again ask Ian to start, and then Phil, I'm going to come to you. What do you think we can take from failure in the context of culture change? Or have you seen examples of where failure happened and lessons weren't learned?
The times when I have seen the outcomes either be disappointing or less than people would have liked are generally where the CEO and the senior leaders of that organization are not fully behind it. You know, there needs to be a sense of alignment. The senior leaders need to be really watertight in giving the credibility to the process and letting everybody know how much it matters to them as leaders. I think that, you know, organizations who don't do that and don't understand how important that is are immediately at a disadvantage trying to create that kind of transformation.
Yeah, so it's about saying, it's about doing, it's about being consistent, right? And it's about doing it 24/7.
And being role models.
Yeah, exactly. Phil, do you have anything to add? And then I'm also going to check on whether Thomas or Franzi wants to comment.
Sure. You know, having come from places like the International Energy Agency and looked at sort of how different energy companies have reacted to the energy transition, very often, you know, the failures are normally happening among the front runners. And when failure happens as a result of taking massive risks and learning, those failures can not only, you know, help an organization learn, but also serve as a basis for the rest of the industry. You know, so when I look at, for example, big difficulties that are happening on the policy side in places like California, you know, what I see is a lot of very ambitious policy moves to try to, you know, adopt a lot more distributed energy, to move to a more flexible grid at a very high speed. And, you know, and while sometimes those kind of moves might be sort of putting the cart before the horse, certainly they provide, you know, extremely valuable lessons that we can all learn from. And I think that that's different than when failure happens as a result of complacency. Yep. Or as a result of siloing. And so I think we have to sort of differentiate, you know, what kind of failures we see to be progressive and things that we can build upon, and the kinds of failures that are as a result of not following that sort of progress.
Okay, great. Thank you. Either of you want to add anything? Because we still have many questions. Anything to add? Okay, good. Before I take a couple of questions from the audience, and I can see there are a few, I wondered if you all have really interesting and diverse experiences. And if I were to put you on the spot today and say, advise a new CEO, leadership team, startup, what advice would you give them around building a culture and making it sustain itself through time? So let's see. I keep looking at Ian, but I'm not going to do it to him again. So I'm actually going to ask Phil, and then I'm going to ask Thomas, and then Franzi, and Ian, you're last this time. So
thanks very much, Annemie. Yeah, I would say that the most important thing, I mean, when you're starting out to build an organization, is to know your customer and reflect your customer. So I would say that, you know, particularly in the context of innovative industries that are, particularly in the energy transition, where we have so much more opportunity than we have had in the past in terms of availability of data, feedback from the customer, and actually pushing down a lot of individual consumer decisions in a way that the traditional utility model never allowed for. Knowing that customer and what kind of decisions, you know, can really empower them, I think is critical as you also start to build your internal company culture. And that means, you know, focusing on issues like diversity, as we've talked about, but also, you know, engaging with the kind of technologies that are necessary so that, you know, you have an idea of what your customer really wants at the end of the day, and how you can pursue strategic aims at the same time as delivering services at the customer level.
Yes, I'm hearing a constant conversation anchored in data, understanding not one way is what you, that would be the advice. Great, thank you. So, Thomas, I think you were next.
Yeah, a thought which went a little bit out of fashion quite recently. I'm still a strong believer that the purpose of a company helps a lot. Our purpose, for example, bringing good energy to the people, which resonates with our colleagues and also with the outside world. Something which was already said, it starts at the top or it doesn't start at all. Thinking about avoid, or start differently, be authentic. Yeah? Visible signals to the organization help if they are put into a context, not if they are not come out of the clear blue. For example, for tomorrow onwards, we don't wear any ties and we call ourselves as first names, end of story. That doesn't help. It needs to be embedded into a cultural context at the end of the day. That's what I would recommend.
Thank you. Franzi.
Yeah, and not wearing tights also helps. So I had a lot of...
Not wearing ties, not tights.
Not tights, sorry. Yeah, it's ties. So it helps because I had a lot of job interviews with externals for working students. So my important way to get new talents on board. And they were quite surprised how easy we are, how, let's say, also technical we are, and it's not the big E.ON, and they are all wearing suits and not calling them on the first name. So that's something that helped. And the aspect you mentioned as well, it's the customer I already talked about, but it's also the employee. So what I brought into my team is the feedback speed dating. It's a tiny way to really have a feedback culture internally.
Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, it's really a feedback, but it's in 2.5 minutes per person. So you have to be prepared, and you have only 5 minutes per pair. And it's also possible to do it via Teams at the moment. And we really love it to do it, let's say, every 2 months. Mm-hmm. So, and the complete team does it. So you talk to each and every colleague, and you only have 2.5 minutes. So you really have to be on point. You have to be honest. You, for sure, have the rules of giving and receiving feedback that is trained as well. And so nothing is like a pink elephant in the room anymore.
But what impact has that had on the culture in your team? And have other teams seen it, observed it? So yeah, what has been the impact?
It was a steal with pride. So a lot of teams adapted it because they said, okay, it's fast, mm-hmm. it's honest, mm-hmm. it's prepared. And now we are much more easier in the way of working together. So the feedback is all over the place, not only in the feedback speed dating, but the feedback speed dating is also fun. Mm-hmm. So it's a bit stressful because you really have to hurry up. But yeah, that helped to give a real feedback culture, not mm-hmm. waiting until the next appointment to do so, but really being honest and learn how to give feedback.
And I think that touches on what Thomas was saying, but Ian, you as well, because actually to create that feedback culture, you had to put a framework in place for it to become natural over time. So again, it doesn't just happen, it requires an active choice, a framework, and then consistency and authenticity. So Ian, your advice?
I think to build on all of the great answers that the other three have given, I would say right up front, you need to define an inspiring purpose that people can get behind, get motivated by, and then create a culture as you build that people have a strong emotional connection to, which also impacts the experience of the customers. But it starts with that really powerful definition of a purpose that's very, very strongly owned internally.
And I can't think of any better place than the energy world to have that strong purpose that can inspire, can anchor, and then attract amazing talent, keep them in an organization to solve some of the world's biggest problems and challenges. I'm going to ask you all to be very brief because there's a really curious question that's popped up, and this is it. So very, very brief, right? Can be even one word, no sentences. So if overnight a miracle happened and one cultural aspect had magically changed that significantly made the energy transformation easier, what would you wish that one aspect to be? One word or one sentence? Up to you guys. So, who shall we go? Oh, Phil, you're smiling. Why don't we go with you?
Sure. You know, for me, it's a long-term value. Looking at long-termism. Yeah.
Right. Thank you. Francie, you can say more than one word, but not more than one sentence.
Let's see. It would be more data available so that it's easier to approach our customers to work with that. So it's not just gathering data, but being available and given by the people.
Yeah, and I think the data topic also then touches even on employees, right? If we had more data available around how our employees felt, I think your example of feedback is an example of data in the employee context. Ian?
I would say to have all employees to be eternally curious about the possibilities for change.
Mm-hmm. How do you do that?
That's about shifting mindsets.
Okay, great. And we had a question about mindset, if we have time. Thomas?
Fostering cooperation and breaking down silos.
Great. So you guys are very good with that answer, which means I think we can put the mindset question back in there. And Ian, I'm going to ask it of you because you mentioned it. So what is the role of mindset in the context of culture?
Human beings are pattern-making creatures. It's how we get through life. Teams create patterns, organizations create patterns. And in neurology, it's about the neural networks by which we operate. And so in a large organization, very often, the legacy is driven by the old right way. Everybody understands the old right way.
That's how we do it around here.
It's how we do it around here. It's the assumptions that people make. The shift in mindsets is in defining the new right way, which is about your from to, Thomas. But it's also not just about defining behaviors and telling people. It's really getting some depth of a shift in belief. And at the heart of that lies insight. So when people really understand why it is that it's so important this transformation happens, back to your point around purpose and energy business, then that kind of aha moment, you can't take an insight away from somebody. Mm-hmm. You know, it's something that once people have had that light bulb moment, they will always have had it. So you need to be able to create a process that creates a large-scale insight, if you like.
Yeah, and to that process, I once heard someone say that you shift mindsets by creating a different way of seeing things, thinking about things, feeling about them, and then doing. So I think to really shift mindset and culture, it's not only about holding on to the mindset, it needs to translate into doing. So I think we're nearly out of time. I'm just going to take a 1 minute to try and provide you with a summary of what we've covered. And if I miss anything, anybody jump in. Phil, you, anybody here? But it was an interesting conversation. And I certainly think some of the reflections that hopefully all of you will have is that it requires planning, commitment from the leadership team. It requires an approach that embraces multiple diverse stakeholders to be part of a journey of cultural transformation and change. It's kind of never done. It's a 24/7 activity, and really also needs to be anchored in data and a different conversation that is had. And I think if all those elements come together, one is able to drive sustainable culture transformation. So with that, did I miss anything, anyone? Nope. Good. Well, with that, just remains for me to say I hope that you enjoyed our session. Thank you for the really interesting and thought-provoking questions. We could not come to all of them, but I think there are going to be lots of other conversations today that certainly started. I wish you a really lovely rest of your day, and with that, Thank you very much, and yeah, see you soon.